Over the last 24 hours, news from the battlefronts in Ukraine strongly suggest that the Wagner organization has taken control of the central areas of Bakhmut. They've controlled the eastern part of Bakhmut, east of the Bakhmutka River for some time. They captured the Azom plant in the north about a week ago, and it now looks as if they have captured the central district of Bakhmut as well. The place where I'm going to make a guess, some of the largest apartment buildings and structures in Bakhmut, which have proved so difficult to capture, are probably situated. Anyway, this is the report from TASS, and it quotes Yevgeny Prigozhin, who claims, in fact, he's not just provided claims, he's actually provided pictures of himself with a flag, and he claims that presumably that same flag has been unfurled over the city administration building in the center of Bakhmut. And this is what TASS reports him as saying. And I should say this comes originally from his own Telegram channel. April 2nd, 2300 hours precisely. Behind me is the building of the city administration. The Russian flag is for Vladlen Tatarsky. I'm going to come to a discussion of Vladlen Tatarsky, a Russian military reporter who has just been assassinated in St. Petersburg. I will come and discuss that later in this program. Anyway, going back to what Prigozhin said, this flag is for Vladlen Tatarsky. In grateful memory is written on this flag, technically, we have captured Bakhmut. Now, notice that he uses the word technically. He is not suggesting that there are no Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut. He's not saying that the entirety of Bakhmut is under Russian control or the Wagner organization's control. Now, I've seen some translations saying that Prigozhin said that Bakhmut is in a legal sense under Russian control with the raising of this flag over the city administration building. The TASS translation, which may be editing a little Prigozhin's words, says that the Russians have technically captured Bakhmut. But as I said, he does allow for the fact that there is still fighting going on in the city. And we've also had another report, also from TASS, which confirms that fighting is still going on in the city. This is from Denis Pushilin, and he said TASS reports him as having said to Russia 24 television, the enemy has not received a corresponding order yet to withdraw from Bakhmut, because it's Artyomovsk. Accordingly, no escape or planned withdrawal of the Ukrainian regime's troops from Artyomovsk is observed. In other words, the Ukrainians are still hanging on, though there's some suggestions, we'll come to that in a moment again, that they've been pushed back to the western districts of this actually relatively small town. And to discuss what's being said from the Ukrainian side, there's an account from the Guardian newspaper, and it quotes, it provides a quotation. Actually, this was given to Reuters by Sergei Cheravati, who is said to be a spokesman of Ukraine's Eastern Military Command. And Sergei Cheravati says, Bakhmut is Ukrainian and they have not captured anything and are very far from doing that, to put it mildly. So that implies that but it doesn't actually specifically deny that Prigozhin's claim that the city administration building has been captured is untrue. And The Guardian goes on to say, there was no indication from Ukrainian officials that Bakhmut had fallen into Russian hands, and Prigozhin has previously made claims about Wagner's military progress in the city that were premature. The last, by the way, is, so far as I'm aware, not true. I do not remember a single occasion in which Prigozhin has come forward and claimed that his forces, the Wagner forces, have captured territory which turned out to be wrong. I have no recollection of anything like that ever happening. It is certainly the case that Ukrainian officials have for weeks denied Russian advances in particular locations. It took them weeks, for example, to finally admit to the loss of Soledar. And of course, recently, the Kiev Independent, whilst discussing the fighting in Avdiivka, effectively said as much. It said that Ukraine very rarely confirms, or is often very slow to confirm, that a particular location has been captured, and that sometimes, but was captured by the Russians, and that sometimes this kind of confirmation is only provided indirectly when the Ukrainian military speak of fighting going on in a place which would only have been reached by the Russians if they had previously captured another place which Ukraine had previously been defending. But also, I have to point out that The Guardian is being a little bit mischievous here because, as I said, it says that there's no indication from Ukrainian officials that Bakhmut had fallen into Russian hands, but that's not in fact what Prigozhin is claiming. Prigozhin is claiming that his troops have captured the city administration building, that they've unfurled their flag there. Perhaps they control the center of Bakhmut. It seems likely that they do, but he's not saying, and has been careful not to say, that the entire town is under Russian control and that there are no Ukrainian troops there. Now, there's been other reports from other Ukrainian sources. There's War Mapper, which provides maps from a Ukrainian perspective of the state of the fighting, and they do seem to suggest, they do appear to confirm that the city administration building in Bakhmut has indeed been captured by the Russians. But then I would say that I don't know where exactly they're getting this report from. It may be that they're simply taking it from what Prigozhin is saying and from the video that he's accompanied. But there's also been a more detailed report from Riba, which is one of the most accurate of and reliable of Russian websites covering the war. They have various reporters or informants on the battlefront, so I'm not entirely clear how Riba works. It's apparently a collective of several war reporters, but Riba has provided a situation report for the state of the Battle of Bakhmut as of 1300 hours, April 3rd, 2023, 1300 hours, that will be local time. In other words, local time in Bakhmut. And it says this: in the north of Bakhmut, assault detachments of the Wagner organization continue to advance in the Silistya area to the south of the city. That would suggest quite a substantial advance from the north. During the fighting, they completely cleared the territory of school number 24. In addition, Russian units have come close to the railway station. In the central districts of the city, the Wagner forces have gained control of residential areas along Boris Gorbatov Street and have also established control of the Bakhmut city administration building. So that's Rybar saying this, and as I said, they have their own reporters and informants. And as I said, I've never known Prigozhin to claim capture of something that his forces have not captured, and Rybar appears to confirm anyway that Prigozhin's claim that the Bakhmut city administration building has been captured is indeed correct. Anyway, Rybar then goes on to say now fighting is going on at school number 11 and the clinic. These are presumably still buildings in central Bakhmut, which is still under Ukrainian control. And then it goes on to say, over the southern outskirts of the city, assault groups continue to expand the zone of control around the avant-garde stadium, moving along Bakhmutskaya Street. Now that is an interesting claim because it refers to the avant-garde stadium, but I have to say straight away that I'm not sure quite what it means, whether they've expanded, the Russians have expanded the area that they control around the avant-garde stadium, which, however, remains under Ukrainian control, or whether it means that the Russians have captured the avant-garde stadium and are expanding their area of control by pushing forward from it. It seems to me this could be interpreted either way. I'm going to assume that the avant-garde stadium is still under Ukrainian control. I would have thought that if it had been captured, there would be a definitive report by now that would confirm as much. And then it goes on to say, the Rybar report goes on to say, at the moment, the armed forces of Ukraine continue to hold the western outskirts of Bakhmut. There are no signs of withdrawal of Ukrainian formations. On the contrary, 80 troops were transferred from the Sumy region to Bakhmut to strengthen positions there. In addition, units of the 5th Assault Brigade, that's of the Ukrainian military, created on the basis of the 5th Assault Regiment, that's presumably an airborne unit, or at least originally an airborne unit, have arrived at the section of the Chasov Yar Khromovo Road. The forces of the 5th Special Forces unit were previously noted only of this particular unit were previously noted only in the Toretsk sector. This confirms the plans of the Ukrainian command to continue the defense of Bakhmut. So, clear evidence that the Russians are now making significant progress in Bakhmut. They've captured the city administration building. Prigozhin says it. Rybar says it. The official that was quoted by The Guardian, Sergei Cherevati, Ukrainian official, doesn't specifically deny it. It's likely that the central areas of Bakhmut have been largely, or perhaps even entirely, captured by the Russians, though there do seem to be some holdouts there. Ukrainian troops have been pushed to the western outskirts of the town, but fighting nonetheless goes on, and the Ukrainians continue to put up a resistance, and it's clear that for the moment it is an organized resistance. By the way, there were also some comments about the fighting in Bakhmut from no less a person than President Zelensky. And President Zelensky, in his nightly address yesterday, said that I'm grateful to our warriors who are fighting near Andreevka, Marinka, near Bakhmut, especially Bakhmut. It's especially hot there today. And he didn't provide any explanation of what he means by that. But I'm not even sure that I like that kind of comment. But anyway, it looks as if the tone of the comment, or so it seems to me, suggests a very difficult situation for Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut. So quite a lot going on, and we'll see what goes on over the next couple of days. But it's clear that for the moment, the Russians continue to have very much the upper hand in Bakhmut, and it looks like fighting in Bakhmut is grinding steadily ever further towards its conclusion, with the Russians in full control of the town. Now, I say that, we still got all those reports about all those Ukrainian forces concentrated around Bakhmut. There have been rumors, reports, speculations about a Ukrainian counterattack in Bakhmut, either to retake all the lost territory in and around the town, or to break the effective siege that the Russians have established in the town. But so far, there's no sign of this counterattack. The Ukrainians seem instead to be focusing principally on trying to keep some kind of opening to Bakhmut from the west. They're still resisting apparently in Ivanivska, despite the fact that there were reports yesterday of a heavy Russian assault on this particular village, which sits astride one of the roads leading into Bakhmut. There was an earlier report which says that the Ukraine has actually positioned 3 brigades in Ivanivska, which gives a sense of how much importance Ukraine gives to control of this particular village. But despite all of that, despite the fact that the Ukrainians are putting up all this resistance, it seems that the Russians, as I said, are gradually pushing through the town. They've either now fully captured or will shortly have fully captured the entire central area of Bakhmut. They will at that point, I presume, control around, 80% of the town, and Ukraine will still be holding out in some areas in the west, but as I said, it's increasingly looking as if the fighting in Bakhmut is going the Russians' way. And there have been more reports, by the way, about fighting in other places. There's been fighting apparently intensifying in Marinka. Marinka is part of the Marinka-Vuhledar battle. The two towns, the fighting in the two towns is connected to each other. It seems generally acknowledged that if one of these places, Marinka specifically perhaps, is captured, then Ukrainian positions in Vuhledar will become, well, if not untenable, they come under very heavy pressure. Whereas if Vuhledar is captured, then Ukrainian resistance at Marinka will become unsustainable, because Ukraine sends its supplies to Marinka via Vuhledar. Now, the situation in Vuhledar for some time has been at a standstill. The Russians made a big push on Vuhledar in January, but they were unable to storm the town, which is easily defended. It's got very high buildings, a little bit like Bakhmut. So they seem to have focused instead on Marinka. And as I said, there's been intense fighting going on in Marinka for months. And I recall that at one point back in the autumn, the Russians even claimed that they'd captured the place, which turned out to be premature. But anyway, regardless of that, there seems to have been another major advance by the Russians, or major push by the Russians in Marinka. And I get the impression that the extent of Ukrainian control in Marinka is now reducing to what might very well become, before very long, unsustainable levels. Now, if Marinka falls, as I said, Ukraine's position in Vuhledar becomes very difficult. Now, I should say that in this part of the battlefronts, there's been a rotation of Russian commanders. The previous long-standing Russian commander in this area, General Muratov, has been relieved and has been replaced by a new commander who's apparently a rather straightforward character, apparently popular with the soldiers. He might have been brought in because there was feelings that General Muratov bungled the capture of Vuhledar in January, and that it was time for somebody to come in and bring a fresh mind to the matter. I would say that Muratov has previously had a pretty good reputation. He was apparently a rather effective commander of the peacekeeping forces in the southern Caucasus, in the Azerbaijan-Armenia conflict area. But apparently in this particular battle, he's proved less successful. And it may be that this latest advance in Marinka is in some way connected to rotation of commanders. And there's been Russian missile strikes on Konstantinovka, another town in this general area, not far from Bakhmut, in fact, about 27 kilometers away from Bakhmut. And there's also accumulating reports now of more and more Russian airstrikes carried out principally by Sukhoi 34 bombers. And they seem to be launching these very big, very powerful, precision-guided gliding bombs on various positions, targeting and seeking to destroy Ukrainian defense lines. Now, I should say Brian Beletic at the New Atlas has done a very interesting video discussing the effectiveness of these gliding bombs, 1,500 kilo bombs. So these are very, very big bombs. You imagine a 1,500 kilo bomb is going to pack far more explosive than a shell launched, a single shell from a tubed artillery piece can do. And of course, some months ago, I had a very interesting email. In fact, it was actually a series of emails from an Indian viewer, a viewer from India who served in the Indian military, but who's also got very extensive background in engineering and technology issues, extremely extensive, who pointed out to me that if you really want to break fortified positions quickly, the best way to do it is with gravity bombs. They're much bigger, they make a far bigger explosive charge, they will strike fortifications where they're most vulnerable, and that the fact that the Russians have been deterred from using their air force to bomb Ukrainian fortifications because of the very extensive air defense system that Ukraine inherited from the Soviet Union, that has been a major factor in slowing the Russian advance in the war, and is the single most important reason why the Russians have had to fight it in this very incremental, attritional way. And this is also, of course, something that was discussed extensively, very extensively yesterday by Brian Beletic, and he's pointed out that the fact that the Russian Air Force is now becoming more active in Andreevka and Bakhmut, by the way, but also increasingly in areas in northern Ukraine, like in Sumy region, where they've been launching bomb attacks as well, as I discussed in another program, suggests that the long campaign that the Russians launched or started back in October with their missile strikes on Ukrainian energy facilities has achieved at least one of its purposes, or largely achieved one of its purposes, which is to deplete Ukraine's air defense system to the point where it's finding it more difficult to counter Russian aircraft, Russian bombers, as they carry out bombing raids over locations, strategic locations in Ukraine. And of course, if the Russian Air Force is able to operate more actively, launch more of these bomb attacks, then Russian advances will accelerate. Now, I think at this point it's worth making one quick point, which is, of course, that the United States is the country with the greatest experience and expertise in precision-guided bomb technology. It pioneered this technology. Well, they didn't actually pioneer this technology. The Germans did during the Second World War. But at least the United States was the first to adopt this technology on a big scale in the 1960s, using precision-guided bombs for the first time in the last stages of the Vietnam War. It used them very extensively in the 1991 war against Iraq. And it has a very large armory of these bombs. The US may be short of artillery shells. It may have difficulty producing artillery shells. It may have difficulty keeping up with demand of HIMARS rockets. It has no shortage of bombs, even of the very expensive and complex precision-guided bombs. And it is intending to supply some of these bombs to Ukraine. And the reason it would presumably want to do that is because the Russians have built up these enormous fortifications in the south of Ukraine, in the southern regions of, well, they don't say it's Ukraine, in Zaporozhye region, in the area blocking the proposed Ukrainian offensive, and in the north, in the Kremenaya Svatovo area, where Ukraine had launched, or had been planning to launch, an offensive in the autumn, following upon its successful offensive in the Kharkov region, but where in fact it was fought to a standstill, and where the Russians in recent weeks have regained the initiative. Now, there is, however, a problem about using these precision-guided bombs, JDAM bombs, that the United States intends to supply to Ukraine. And in an interesting way, these were highlighted, though indirectly, by Brian Beletic's program, which is that, of course, the reason the Russian Air Force is becoming much more active now and is able to start dropping these bombs with increasing frequency and increasing effectiveness on Ukrainian defenses along the front lines, is because Ukraine's air defense system, built around the S-300 missiles, as I said, bequeathed to the Ukraine by the Soviet Union, its air defense system has now become very severely depleted. And of course, its air force has become depleted as well. For Ukraine to launch bomb attacks of the same kind on Russian fortifications in Zaporozhye region and in the Svatovo Kremenaya area would be much more difficult and far more dangerous. The reason is that the Russian air defense system, which, to be clear, is much more extensive and far more sophisticated than Ukraine's ever was, is, of course, fully functioning. And the Russians have all their various very long-range missiles, the S-400, the various iterations of the S-300 system. They're all operating there on the battlefronts, and they absolutely do have the reach to shoot down any Ukrainian aircraft that come heavily laden with these kind of bombs and attempt to approach these fortified positions at the very high altitudes at which these sort of bombs are released. And of course, if the aircraft try to fly lower, the Russians have an enormously dense air defense system with multiplicities of shorter range missiles and guns that they can also use to shoot down Ukrainian aircraft that fly closer to the Russian fortified lines. And again, this is immeasurably more dense than anything that Ukraine has or which the West can supply to Ukraine. And of course, and this is not to overlook the fact that Russia also operates a far more powerful air force than Ukraine. Many of these Russian fighter jets, like the Sukhoi 35, the Sukhoi 57, and the MiG-31, have very long range, extremely long range air-to-air missiles. They have been used very effectively to shoot down Ukrainian aircraft. To be frank, I think it would be exceptionally difficult for the Ukrainians to reproduce what the Russians are now starting to do, and to use precision-guided bombs to attack Russian fortified lines. Anyway, that's the situation on the battlefronts. Yesterday, the big news in Russia was not the raising of the flag over the city administration building in Bakhmut. It was the murder of Vladlen Tatarsky, a person from the Donbass who's fought in the Donbass militia. He's been an active fighter since 2014, the fighting in 2014. And he's also been, well, the Western media calls him a blogger. The Ukrainians and some parts of the Western media called him a propagandist. I would call him a war reporter. I've read his reports from time to time. Obviously, they reflect his very passionate loyalties to the Donbass cause, which is one reason, by the way, why I've tended to use them less in my own discussions. But anyway, he was a reporter. He did provide his views of what was happening, and of course he was a combatant as well. And he was killed in St. Petersburg, where he was attending an event, and a young woman, who has, by the way, now been arrested, gave him a statuette at this particular event, and the statuette contained a bomb, and the bomb exploded, and he was killed. And importantly, this was a crowded event in a cafe. Quite a few other people were injured as well. Now, I'm going to say straight away, I think this is an appalling act. I think it was a deeply shocking, horrible act of murder in a civilian city. There's no indication, I've never seen any indication that the Russians have ever tried to do anything similar in any city in Ukraine under Ukrainian control. I've never heard of them infiltrating people to try and murder people in that kind of a way. On the battle lines, people of course die, and it is a terrible thing. But in the rear, in this fashion, well, I've never known the Russians to do that. Now, this investigation is at its early stages.